has given the most remarkable, devoted service to the Queen, to my family, and to the country, and also to the whole of the Commonwealth.
Nobody saw it coming. Not the journalists camped outside Buckingham Palace. Not the constitutional experts who had spent decades studying the monarchy. Not even the closest members of the royal household who believed the tension between Charles and Harry had finally reached some kind of cold, manageable silence. And then the announcement dropped. No press conference, no royal broadcast, no warning delivered through the usual unofficial channels that allow powerful institutions to soften the blow before the public absorbs it. Just a single official declaration posted directly from the palace. And within it, two names that stopped Britain cold. Archie Lilibet, the grandchildren of King Charles III, the children of Prince Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, born into the House of Windsor, connected by blood to the most famous royal dynasty on earth, and now, by royal decision, removed from the line of succession, the centuries-old constitutional order that determines who may one day inherit the British throne. The announcement did not ask for forgiveness. It did not offer an explanation wrapped in warmth or family feeling. It was precise, deliberate, and final in the way that only royal authority can be. Charles had made his decision. The advisors had approved the wording. The palace had released the statement. And across 2 continents, the consequences began landing before most people had even finished reading the first paragraph. What made this moment different from every other royal controversy of the past 2 decades was not simply the scale of the decision. The monarchy had survived abdications, divorces, public breakdowns, and spectacular betrayals before. What made this different was who the decision had fallen upon. 2 young children who had never been given a single say in any of the choices that led to this moment. Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor was born in May 2019. Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor was born in June 2021. Between them, they carried the names of queens, the bloodlines of 2 royal families, and a specific weight of being Harry and Meghan's children. Children born into a storm they had no power to escape or control. Their father had left the royal family. Their mother had walked away from an institution she described as damaging, controlling, and indifferent to her pain. Harry and Meghan had relocated to California, given interviews that shook the monarchy to its foundation, written a memoir that exposed conversations once protected behind closed palace doors, and built a life entirely on their own terms thousands of miles from the country that had once defined everything about who they were allowed to be. And now their children were being removed from a succession they had never been asked to carry. The question that stopped people mid-conversation, on railway platforms, in office corridors, around television screens across Britain and beyond, was not simply whether Charles had the authority to make this decision. He did. The question that carried the real weight was something far more uncomfortable. Should he have? Charles sat alone with the document for longer than anyone on his staff expected. The text had been reviewed by constitutional advisors, cleared by senior palace officials, and refined through multiple drafts until every word carried precisely the meaning the monarch intended. There was no ambiguity left in the language. No phrase that could be reinterpreted as temporary or open to negotiation. The declaration was complete, legally sound, and ready for release. Still, the king did not immediately reach for the pen. Those closest to him understood what was happening in that silence. Charles had spent months wrestling with this decision, not the constitutional logic behind it, which had become increasingly clear to his advisors as the months passed, but the human cost of what signing his name would mean. He was not simply removing 2 positions from an official government document. He was making a permanent, public, and entirely irreversible declaration about the future of his son's children, about the future of a family that had already been torn apart in ways the palace could not fully control or contain. The line of succession is not a ceremonial list. Most people understand it only as the ranking printed in newspapers during major royal events. The order in which family members appear below the reigning monarch, the sequence that tells the country who would take the throne if extraordinary circumstances demanded it. but its meaning inside the palace runs far deeper than public ceremony. To be in the line of succession is to carry a constitutional identity. It is to exist within the legal and historical structure of the British state. It connects a person not just to the royal family, but to the country itself, to the national continuity that the monarchy has represented for centuries, through wars and reforms and constitutional crises that have repeatedly tested whether the institution could survive. Removing 2 children from that structure meant breaking something that had been established at their births. Archie had been born into the succession. Lilibet had been born into it. Neither had been consulted. Neither had been given the option of declining the position or accepting it on their own terms. They had simply arrived, carrying the Windsor name and everything attached to it, including, as it turned out, everything that could one day be taken away. Charles raised the document one final time and read through the key paragraph. His lips moved slightly. An aide standing near the door later described a stillness in the room that felt different from the normal focused quiet of official royal business. This was the stillness of a man performing a calculation that no constitutional formula could complete, weighing duty against relationship, institution against family, long-term necessity against immediate and certain pain. He placed the pen against the paper. He thought of Harry as a young boy. He thought of his own long, complicated relationship with a monarchy that had often felt colder than a family should be. He thought of Archie's face, a face he had barely seen in person during the years since the Sussex departure. Then he signed his name, looked at the aide, and said 2 words. "Release it." The message arrived on Harry's phone in the early afternoon California time. He had been told to expect some form of communication from the palace. His team had been monitoring signals coming through the usual unofficial channels, the quiet warnings from contacts inside royal circles that something was being prepared. But the specific nature of the announcement had been kept tightly sealed. The inner circle around Charles had understood that if Harry received advance notice of the full decision, he would fight it through whatever legal and public channels he could access before the palace had the chance to frame the story on its own terms. So the message arrived without warning, carrying the official palace language that stripped away any remaining ambiguity. Harry read Archie's name first. He read it twice, the way a person rereads a sentence when the meaning refuses to settle. Then Lilibet's name appeared in the same context, carrying the same devastating implication. He lowered the phone slowly and stood, without moving for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Meghan walked into the room and immediately understood from his posture that something had happened. She asked what it was. He did not answer immediately. She asked again, and this time she watched his face complete the transition from shock into something harder. The specific expression of a person whose worst fear has just been confirmed in writing. He told her both children had been removed. What followed in that room was not the loud, explosive anger that the public might have expected from 2 people who had spent years building a case against the institution that had just delivered this blow. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more devastating. Meghan sat down. Harry remained standing, and for several minutes, neither of them said anything that could be repeated in a palace briefing or a legal statement or a carefully worded public response. Because what had happened to them in that moment was not constitutional. It was personal. Their children's names had been on a document they had never asked to be associated with, in an institution they had left to protect themselves and their family. And now those names had been removed, not through a process that included them, not through a conversation that respected them as parents, but through a unilateral decision delivered via formal message. Meghan was the first to say what both of them were thinking. She said the palace had reduced Archie and Lilibet to entries on an administrative list and then struck through them without a phone call. Harry didn't have a response to that, because she was right. His advisors called within the hour. They walked him through the public statement being prepared, the legal options available, the media strategy that would allow the Sussex side of the story to reach the public before the palace narrative became permanent. Harry listened to all of it. He gave no instructions. He asked for time, because what his advisors were offering him were tools for a public battle. And what he was sitting with, alone in the afternoon quiet of a California afternoon, was something that no public statement could touch. He had failed to protect his children from the institution he had left specifically to protect them from. That was the wound beneath all the constitutional language. That was what made the announcement feel less like a royal decision and more like a final verdict on a family that had been fractured long before this day. But what the world did not yet know, and what would only become clear as the full story emerged, was that this announcement had not come suddenly. It had been building for months, triggered by a private moment inside Windsor Castle that Charles had been unable to stop replaying in his mind ever since it happened. There are moments inside royal life that the public never hears about. Private ceremonies, family gatherings, institutional observances that carry enormous emotional weight within the walls of the palace, but exist in a kind of sealed silence from the outside world. The palace has always understood that some moments must be protected from public scrutiny, not because they are shameful, but because their real meaning belongs to the people who were present, and exposure would reduce something complex and human into headline material. The ceremony inside Windsor Castle that began the final push toward Charles's decision was one of those protected moments. It marked the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II's accession, the date she formally became sovereign following the death of her father, King George VI. Within royal tradition, this date carries specific significance. It is not a celebration in the conventional sense. It is a commemoration, an acknowledgement of the weight of inheritance and the duties it places upon those who carry it. Every year, a private gathering within the palace marks the occasion. Family members connected to the crown are expected to attend. A formal reading takes place, acknowledging those whose names belong to the royal family and the institution's ongoing story. Archie's name was read aloud, then Lilibet's, and then a silence fell that nobody in the room knew quite what to do with. Both children were absent. They were thousands of miles away in California, living a life that had no visible connection to the institution whose roll call had just included their names. 2 seats had been symbolically reserved for them, an acknowledgement that they existed, that they belonged to the Windsor family, that the connection between the crown and these 2 small children had not been legally severed, whatever the emotional distance might suggest. Charles looked at those empty seats. He had spent years telling himself that the complexity of the Sussex situation could be managed with patience, that the distance between Harry and the palace was painful but not necessarily permanent, that Archie and Lilibet were young, too young to understand the fractures in the family above them, and that their connection to the crown existed as a bridge that time might eventually allow someone to cross. But in that moment, with 2 names echoing through a room and 2 seats empty and every person present somehow managing to avoid meeting the king's eyes, Charles understood something he had been resisting understanding. The bridge had not been maintained. It had been allowed to deteriorate from both sides, and now it stood as a symbolic structure, present on paper, meaningless in practice. Children do not inherit constitutional positions in the abstract. They inherit them as part of a living relationship with the country, the institution, and the duties that position demands. And the children named on that roll call had no living relationship with any of it. He approached a senior advisor afterward and asked a question that the advisor later described as the sharpest he had ever been asked to answer. He wanted to know whether the monarchy was genuinely preserving a family bond by keeping Archie and Lilibet in the succession, or whether it was simply maintaining the appearance of connection, because removing 2 children would look cruel from the outside. The advisor did not answer immediately, and Charles, who had spent decades learning to read the silences of powerful people, understood exactly what that hesitation meant. He commissioned the constitutional memorandum the following morning, sealed, confidential, addressed to a small circle of senior advisors and constitutional experts. Its central question was not rhetorical. It was practical, direct, and brutal in the way that genuine institutional questions must eventually be. Should succession remain automatic when any realistic path towards service has disappeared? No cameras, no secretaries, no palace staff stationed near the door with note-taking pads, and the professional neutrality of people trained to witness high-stakes conversations without visibly reacting to them. Just Charles, just Harry, just a polished table carrying the weight of everything that had happened between them and everything that had never been said. Harry had returned to Britain specifically for this meeting. When word reached him through private channels that the constitutional memorandum was no longer an internal discussion, that it had moved from examination to recommendation, he understood that the window for preventing the decision was closing. He contacted the palace directly and demanded a private conversation. He rejected the suggestion that senior aides be present on either side. He understood, perhaps better than anyone outside the palace, that once constitutional advisors were in the room, the conversation stopped being a family discussion and became an institutional negotiation in which he would inevitably be outmaneuvered. Charles agreed to see him alone. The king arrived carrying the sealed memorandum. He placed it on the table between them and left it there, not as a threat, but as evidence. Evidence that the process had already moved far beyond the point where a single conversation could stop it. Evidence that the question was no longer whether to act, but how to explain the action in terms that did not reduce two children to casualties of an adult conflict. Harry opened by asking how removing Archie and Lilibet from the succession could strengthen a family that was already fractured beyond what most institutions would have survived. It was a genuine question, not a rhetorical attack. He wanted to understand the logic, the actual reasoning inside the palace that had produced a decision this severe. Charles answered carefully. He said the monarchy could not indefinitely promise constitutional roles to people being raised with no expectation of serving Britain, no preparation for the duties attached to the crown, and no direct relationship with the country whose future the succession was designed to protect. This was not, he insisted, a judgment on his grandchildren's worth as human beings. It was a judgment about the meaning of constitutional inheritance, about whether a position in the line of succession could remain real if the person holding it had no living connection to what that position demanded. Harry listened to this, and then said something that cut through the constitutional language entirely. He said Archie and Lilibet were being punished for a choice neither of them had made. His departure from royal life, the decision that had set every subsequent event in motion, had been his, not theirs. They had not chosen to be born in California, or raised in California, or educated outside the British system. They had not chosen to grow up far from Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle and the institutional life that would have connected them to the crown. They were children, and children do not choose their geography any more than they choose the family they are born into. Charles removed his glasses and placed them beside the memorandum. He said he knew that. He said the worst part of the decision was that it required penalizing two people for a distance created by others. But he asked Harry to consider the alternative, a succession that included names attached to people with no relationship to Britain, no preparation for royal duty, and no likelihood of ever developing either. He asked whether that served Archie and Lilibet, or whether it merely kept them tethered to an institution they would one day discover had held their names as symbols rather than as genuine constitutional reality. Harry pushed his chair back and stood. He told Charles to speak as a grandfather, not as a sovereign. He said that behind all the constitutional language was a grandfather who had chosen an institution over his grandchildren, and that Archie and Lilibet would eventually understand that clearly, regardless of how carefully the palace worded the announcement. Charles stayed seated. He did not raise his voice. He said he had delayed this decision for precisely that reason, that every month of hesitation had been an attempt to find some path that preserved both duty and family. He had not found one, and allowing the situation to continue indefinitely was not preservation of the family bond. It was the pretense of one. He offered one final possibility. Archie and Lilibet could maintain a defined relationship with Britain through regular contact with their grandfather, through future understanding of royal responsibility, through a connection that was real rather than constitutional. Harry could bring his children to see their grandfather. The palace would welcome that. The door was not being closed. Harry heard this and understood it as something the king did not intend it to be. He heard it as an offer of relationship in exchange for acceptance of the decision. He accused the palace of using constitutional authority to compel the outcome Charles wanted. to pressure him into bringing his children back into contact with an institution he had left specifically because that institution had damaged his family. Charles's expression did not change, but his answer was the one line from the entire meeting that would matter more than anything else either man had said. He said refusing every connection while demanding every constitutional privilege could not continue indefinitely. Harry left the room, believing the decision could still be challenged. Charles remained seated for a long time after the door closed, knowing that it could not. Royal decisions of this magnitude do not happen through a single signature. They move through systems, layers of advisors, legal experts, constitutional specialists, and senior officials whose job is to ensure that when the palace speaks, the words are legally defensible, institutionally coherent, and capable of surviving the scrutiny that inevitably follows. Charles had signed the authorization, but the machinery that would transform his decision into an irreversible public fact was already in motion before the pen touched paper. Constitutional advisors had spent weeks preparing the legal and parliamentary pathway, the formal process through which royal rules are examined, modified, and recognized by the British state. This was not simply a palace internal decision. The line of succession operates within a framework established by Parliament, and any change to it required more than royal will. It required institutional process carried out with the precision that the Crown had learned through centuries of precedent was the only protection against the chaos that informal decisions eventually produce. The palace framed the decision around a principle that was difficult to argue against publicly, even for those who found the outcome heartbreaking. Succession rights, the official position held, should remain connected to Britain, to public duty, to a genuine relationship with the country, to a willingness to serve the institution and the people whose national identity it represented. Without that connection, constitutional inheritance risked becoming exactly what its critics had always accused it of being: privilege without responsibility, title without service, a birthright claimed from thousands of miles away, while the country that granted it remained entirely abstract. William knew the review was underway. The future king had been informed through the proper channels, briefed by the same advisors preparing the final recommendation, and given the opportunity to raise objections before the process reached a point of no return. His name would never appear on the formal documents as a co-decision maker, but his silence, his lack of recorded objection, functioned as something close to approval from the person most directly affected by whatever the succession would look like in the decades ahead. He found his father alone at Windsor the evening before the final authorization was signed. The conversation between them was short, and what William said was neither an endorsement nor a protest. He told Charles that the decision might protect the monarchy's structure, but that history would judge whether they had protected it at a cost that eventually proved too high. He said the two children named in the constitutional language would one day read every word written about this moment, and that whatever the palace said about institutional necessity, Archie and Lilibet would absorb the human meaning long before they absorbed the constitutional one. Charles heard this and did not dismiss it. He admitted to his son that his deepest fear was not that the decision would be remembered as cruel by constitutional historians. It was that his grandchildren would grow up knowing him first through the act that removed them, that the word grandfather for Archie and Lilibet would carry the shadow of this decision before it carried anything warmer. His voice had faltered slightly before he composed it. Then he picked up the pen. The final document had been deliberately drawn to avoid the harshest possible outcome. A more aggressive proposal had been presented earlier in the process, one that would have removed not just the succession positions, but every remaining royal association attached to the Sussex children, stripping them of titles, family acknowledgement, and any formal connection to the Windsor name. Charles had rejected this immediately. He wanted a boundary drawn between family and crown, a clear, permanent boundary that the institution required, but he did not want the total erasure of two grandchildren from a family story they had not chosen to leave. The distinction looked careful inside the palace. Outside it, the world would not care about the difference between partial removal and total erasure. They would see the names gone from the list, and they would draw their own conclusions about what a grandfather had decided was worth protecting. But by the time that reality set in, the document was already signed, sealed, and traveling across the Atlantic at the speed of a news alert. The palace announcement reached California in a way that all significant news reaches people now. Not through a phone call from a family member, not through a formal letter delivered by a courier, but through the cascade of simultaneous digital notifications that make the modern world feel both impossibly connected and brutally impersonal. Meghan saw it first. She had been monitoring the palace communications through a combination of personal contacts and professional advisors who understood the rhythms of British royal media cycles better than most journalists. She had known something was coming. What she had not known, what no one outside the most sealed inner circle of Charles's advisors had known, was the specific and irreversible form it would take. She refreshed the official palace succession page. The list had changed. The constitutional record, the official public document showing the legal order in which members of the royal family could inherit the throne, no longer included two names that had been there when she last checked. Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor was gone. Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor was gone. In their place was simply the continuation of a list, moving forward as though the two children who had once occupied those positions had never existed within it. She stared at the screen for a moment. Then she closed the laptop. Not slammed it. Closed it deliberately, firmly, with the specific controlled movement of someone choosing not to let a physical reaction become the defining image of a devastating moment. She turned to Harry and said something that captured the wound beneath all the constitutional language, the thing that no palace explanation could erase. She said the royal family had turned blood into something conditional. Harry's advisors assembled the options within minutes. The path forward had been prepared in advance. His team was not naive about the possibility that this moment would arrive, and they walked him through three possible responses, ranging from immediate legal challenge to a measured public statement to a period of deliberate silence, while the palace narrative was allowed to settle before being contested from a position of relative calm. Each option carried a cost. Legal challenge would keep the story alive in courtrooms and headlines for months or years, placing Archie and Lilibet's names at the center of a public battle whose tone and content would be largely determined by the combatants rather than the children themselves. Immediate public statement allowed the Sussex side of the story to reach the world before the palace framing became dominant, but risked the accusation of weaponizing children's names for personal and political purposes. Silence ceded the first chapter of the story entirely to the institution that had just delivered the blow. Harry sat with all of this and found that none of it addressed what he was actually feeling. He was not, in that moment, primarily thinking as a public figure constructing a media strategy. He was thinking as a father who had made a specific choice, a choice that had required enormous courage and had come at enormous personal cost. And that choice had now been used as justification for a decision that fell upon his children. He had left royal life to protect his family, and his family had just been reduced on the official succession document of the institution he had left to protect them from. The guilt was immediate and total. He told Meghan he had handed the monarchy the argument it needed by leaving. If he had stayed, if he had endured whatever he had needed to endure inside the palace, Archie and Lilibet would still be on that list. Meghan rejected this directly and completely. She told him that was precisely the kind of thinking the institution wanted him to absorb. The belief that the only way to protect their children was to sacrifice himself to a system that had already demonstrated it would not protect any of them. They had left to give their children a life free from the pressures, exposures, and institutional demands that had made royal life so damaging. That choice had been right. The fact that the palace had used it against the children was the palace's failure, not his. He heard her. He did not entirely believe her. Not yet. Charles received a private message from Harry sometime in the hours that followed the announcement. The palace did not release the content of that message, but those close to the king described his reaction as something distinct from the controlled institutional calm he had maintained throughout the signing process. He read it twice. He placed the phone face down, and he sat for a while in the kind of silence that carries the weight of something irreversible. Harry's team had the statement ready. It had been written and revised through several drafts, each iteration sharpening the language until what remained was precise, unambiguous, and devastating in the way that only truth delivered at exactly the right moment can be. The statement accused the institution directly. It said the palace had directed punishment toward children who had no voice in any of the decisions that led to this moment. It said the constitutional process had been used as a mechanism for settling adult conflicts at the expense of two people too young to understand what was being taken from them or why. It was not the language of negotiation. It was the language of someone who had decided that restraint had costs as well as benefits, and that the moment for carefully calibrated public silence had passed. Harry read it one final time, and his finger was close to the authorization that would send it. His phone rang. The number was familiar. He looked at it for a moment before answering. Because Catherine, Princess of Wales, had not contacted him directly, without William, without palace approval, without the knowledge of the advisors managing communication between the two branches of the royal family, in a very long time. She asked for 10 minutes before he released anything. He agreed reluctantly, not because he trusted the institution she was part of, not because he believed she was calling to change what had already happened, but because her voice carried the specific quality of someone calling from concern rather than strategy, and even in the middle of everything, he could hear the difference. She told him something that cut through every draft of every statement his team had prepared. She said Archie and Lilibet would one day search their own names. They would find every headline, every accusation, every piece of language exchanged during the weeks and months when their names had been the center of an international battle between their father and their grandfather. They would read it all. They would absorb it before they were old enough to have developed the emotional framework for processing what adults do to each other when institutions and families collide. She asked Harry what he wanted their first understanding of this moment to be. He said silence felt like abandoning his children. He could not allow the palace to remove their constitutional place and then control the story of why it happened while he stayed quiet and let the official framing become permanent. Catherine understood the fear. She said defending the children did not require trapping them forever inside the same battle from which he had spent years trying to free them. The line of succession, the legal record, the official position, the constitutional ranking, could change without determining anything about who Archie and Lilibet were as people, or what their lives would mean, or what their futures could hold. Harry's voice dropped. He admitted the thing he had been carrying since the moment he read the announcement. The specific fear that his son would one day believe something had been taken from him because of who his father was. That Archie's first understanding of his own story would be shaped by his father's departure and his grandfather's decision, rather than by anything Archie himself had chosen or created. Catherine listened to this without interrupting. Then she said something that would stay with him long after the call ended. She told him Archie and Lilibet would be shaped far more by the love inside their home than by the position their names once held on a palace list. She said the emotional meaning those children would inherit was still entirely within Harry's power to determine. The palace had removed a constitutional position. It had not removed the capacity of a father to show his children, every day and in every way that mattered, exactly who they were and exactly how much they were valued. Then she told him what William had shared privately with her. Charles had rejected the proposal to remove every remaining title and every formal royal association from the Sussex children. He had drawn a line, a painful, permanent contested line, but he had not closed every door. Personal contact remained possible. The grandfather who had signed the document was still a grandfather. Harry withdrew the aggressive statement. He authorized a measured response instead, one that said Archie and Lilibet's dignity, identity, and worth would never be determined by constitutional ranking. One that said the Sussex family would not be defined by what had been removed, but by what remained: family, love, and the freedom to build a future on their own terms. It was by the standards of the fight he might have chosen, remarkably restrained. And it changed the atmosphere of what followed in ways that no aggressive statement could have managed. By morning, the decision belonged to the country. It had passed from the controlled environment of palace machinery and constitutional process into the open, unpredictable space of public opinion, where legal precision dissolves almost immediately beneath the far more powerful forces of emotion, instinct, and the particular British talent for strong feelings about the royal family. Television studios interrupted their regular programming to host panels of historians, constitutional experts, former palace advisors, and royal commentators who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of moment. The language of succession, the formal terminology of inheritance and duty and constitutional obligation, was being heard by people who knew it from newspaper headlines rather than legal documents, and the translation that occurred between official meaning and public understanding was dramatic. People did not hear a carefully reasoned institutional decision about the relationship between constitutional privilege and royal service. They heard that a grandfather had removed his grandchildren from the family's official inheritance list without a phone call. The newspapers made choices that revealed exactly where they stood. Some led with the constitutional language, the legal precision that Charles's advisors had worked so hard to establish as the dominant frame. Others made different choices. One major London paper ran 3 words across its entire front page, in the largest type the format allowed. The names removed. Beneath those words were 2 photographs, childhood images of Archie and Lilibet, selected from the small number of public images the Sussex family had permitted over the years. Below that, smaller, was an image of Charles signing an official document. Not the specific document in question, which had been signed in private, but the visual implication was unmistakable. On one side of the page, 2 children. On the other, the authority that had made a decision about their future. The contrast was not subtle. It was not meant to be. Outside Buckingham Palace, people gathered near the gates in numbers that surprised the officers stationed there. Not a crowd in the sense of organized protest. No signs, no coordinated chanting, no visible leadership. Just people who had felt the need to be near the place where the decision had originated, who seemed to be processing something that words had not yet fully captured for them. One woman placed 2 white flowers beside the railings. A broadcaster recording footage of the gathering captured what she said when asked to explain the gesture. She said the children might not understand today, but they would understand one day. Those words spread faster than any expert panel's analysis, because they expressed the thing that legal language could not, the understanding that constitutional decisions have human endings, and that the people whose names appear in official documents eventually grow old enough to read them. Charles watched the coverage from a private room. Camilla sat beside him. When a broadcaster referred to the announcement as the loneliest decision of his reign, the Queen Consort noticed him lower his eyes as photographs of Archie and Lilibet filled the screen. She told him the palace clarification needed to be released immediately. The official statement explaining that the decision concerned constitutional rank alone and did not represent any severing of the personal family bond between Charles and his grandchildren. He agreed, but he understood what she understood, even without saying it. Careful wording released after a front-page photograph of 2 children and a signing king could not erase the image already fixed in the public mind. The palace could explain. It could clarify. It could provide constitutional context until the experts were satisfied. But the country had already decided what it felt. William faced it directly during a public engagement scheduled before the announcement. An official appearance he could not cancel without creating its own headline. A man in the crowd called out from the press barriers, loudly enough for the cameras to catch the question clearly. He asked whether Archie and Lilibet were still family. William paused, not the calculated pause of someone performing consideration, a genuine pause, the kind that happens when a person is reaching for a true answer rather than a prepared one. Then he said, "They will always be family." 4 words, traveling faster than the palace statement, carrying more weight than any constitutional clarification, because they sounded like what they were, a human being speaking from something real in a moment when institutional language had briefly run out of usefulness. The final chapter of this story does not take place in a palace room or a courtroom or a television studio where experts debate the long-term constitutional implications of what Charles had decided. It takes place in the future, in the years ahead, when two children grow old enough to understand what happened before they were old enough to have a voice in it. Charles wrote a private letter to both grandchildren. The palace did not release its contents. What those close to the situation understood was that the letter attempted to do something the public announcement could not. It tried to separate the role of sovereign from the role of grandfather, and to reach across the distance the decision had created with something more personal than constitutional language allows. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not defend the decision in terms his grandchildren would be asked to accept. He simply told them that the crown had required one choice, and being their grandfather represented a different and entirely separate promise. He asked only that they read his words when they were old enough to decide for themselves what kind of relationship, if any, they wanted with him. Harry received the letter and placed it in a drawer. He told Meghan that the decision of whether to open it belonged to Archie and Lilibet and to no one else. She agreed immediately, because for the first time since the announcement, something in the story had shifted from adult decisions being made about children to a moment that genuinely invited the children to one day make a decision of their own. Archie asked why so many people had been calling. He had noticed the way children notice things, without alarm, but with the specific attention of a mind that understands something significant is happening around it, even when the adults are carefully managing what he hears. Harry knelt beside him. He said that adults were having a conversation about royal history. He said it was complicated in the way that family stories sometimes become complicated. He said that nothing about who Archie was had changed, and nothing about how much he was loved had changed, and that whatever else happened, those two things were permanent in ways that nothing and no one could alter. The Duke could not restore a constitutional position with those words. He could not undo what had been decided. He could not rewrite the legal record that would exist for as long as the British monarchy existed. But he gave his son something the palace never could have given him, and something the succession document could not have carried even when his name appeared on it. Certainty without conditions. Love that did not come with institutional requirements attached. A father's promise that existed entirely outside the architecture of royal authority, immune to royal decisions, unreachable by palace advisors, and permanent in the only way that ultimately matters. William met with Charles privately in the days following the announcement. The future king did not offer comfort, and he did not revisit the decision. He told his father that the palace had preserved the monarchy's structural logic, but that preservation was not the end of the story. Reconciliation, if it ever came, would require something beyond careful wording and constitutional precision. It would require actions. Genuine ones, actions that reached across the distance the decision had deepened and asked for nothing in return. Charles accepted this without arguing. The king had done what he believed the institution demanded. He had drawn the line that duty required. And in doing so, he had confirmed something that the royal family has learned, forgotten, and been forced to learn again across every generation of its modern history. Institutions can be preserved, but the families within them are fragile in ways that no constitutional document can fully protect. The structure survives. The people inside it carry the cost. Archie and Lilibet no longer hold positions in the line of succession. Their names have been removed from the official legal record of British royal inheritance. The constitutional argument has been settled in the cold and permanent way that only royal authority can settle things. But they have not been erased from history. They have not been removed from a family, however fractured that family has become. And they have not been stripped of the one thing that no monarch has the power to take from them: the future. A future they will build themselves on their own terms in a life that belongs entirely to them. The crown list changed. 2 names disappeared from it, and 2 children stepped out from beneath the crown's shadow, carrying something heavier and something lighter than a constitutional position ever was. They carried their own story, still being written, still entirely theirs.